Hello, this is Colonial Puppet, and in this video I thought I would show off my crippling addiction to collecting vintage Apple products, starting with my collection of desktops and all-in-one computers. I'll be starting this showcase off with the newest addition to my collection, which is also ironically the oldest computer in the collection, the Apple II Plus. The Apple II Plus was released as of the recording of this video 42 years ago in June of 1979, and it was discontinued in December of 1982. It shipped with either 16, 32, or 48 kilobytes of RAM soldered to the motherboard, but was expandable to 64 kilobytes with the addition of an expansion card. The main reason that I got this computer was that I wanted something as close to the original Apple II as possible, but something that I didn't have to sell my plasma to afford. And it is nearly identical to the original Apple II minus the green plus that is present in the logo. Popping the hood, you can see that 3 of the 7 expansion slots are populated. It looks like there's a RAM expansion card installed, possibly bringing this computer up to 64K of RAM, as well as a parallel printer card and a dual floppy controller card. That floppy controller card should come in handy for these 2 Apple Disk 2 disk drives that I purchased for this machine. Although, like the computer itself, these disk drives are going to need a good cleaning and possible restoration work. You can see where the cables to the floppy drives and printer slot directly into the cards themselves and then route out the back through those 3 slots. Evidently, the previous owner didn't know this and decided to disconnect the peripherals the fun way. Like I said, this is the newest addition to the collection, and I haven't really had a chance to turn it on to test its functionality or give it a good cleaning. So I would expect to see this computer again on this channel in a possible restoration video. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all I have to say about the Apple II Plus and its 2 disk drives at the moment. Like I said, it's a new addition to the collection, and I haven't really had a chance to sit down and tinker with it yet. So next we will move on to the Apple IIc. The Apple IIc was released in April of 1984 for just under $1,300. Here you can see I have almost a full setup minus the Apple IIc's matching mouse and secondary 5¼ disk drive. At least this IIc has a matching monitor, although this one is unfortunately completely dead. And after watching Adrian Black's teardown of one of these monitors, I need to build up a bit more self-confidence before attempting any repairs on this thing.
Ooh, it's relatively crusty in here, that's for sure. Crusty burger, as Dave Jones says.
But for now, it just looks cool, completing the whole Apple IIc aesthetic. And I always thought these tiny CRTs were named something like the Apple IIc monitor, but the back has it labeled simply as monitor. It also looked like this monitor belonged to Ohio University at some point. The computer itself, on the other hand, has been fully restored both cosmetically and in terms of function, as demonstrated by this slightly period incorrect LCD monitor. On the other hand, the power brick and composite video cable are period correct, although it looks like the power brick had some work done to it. Overall, the Apple IIc is a pretty neat iteration of the Apple II, and with its compact size and equivalent of 5 expansion cards integrated into the logic board, it makes for a great jumping off point for someone who is just getting into collecting vintage Apple computers. And with that, let's now move on to the Apple IIe Platinum. While the Apple IIe was released initially in January of 1983, putting it before the Apple IIc chronologically, the Apple IIe Platinum was released later in 1987. The most apparent external differences between the original IIe and the IIe Platinum are the revised keyboard, now including a numeric keypad, as well as a silkscreen logo type as opposed to the original IIe's badge. This IIe is no stranger to the channel, as I replaced a blown Rifa capacitor and its power supply in an earlier video. Also not strangers to this channel are the included IIe monitor, external 5¼ disk drive, and Apple IIe mouse. However, a new addition to this Apple II setup is this Apple Duo disc, which, yeah, is definitely going to need some TLC, perhaps yet another future restoration video. Comparing the IIe and the II Plus, you can see the change in keyboard and logo layouts. And moving to the back, you can see the IIe has an added Apple serial port for the mouse, as well as knockout plugs for expansion card ports as opposed to the slots of the Apple II Plus. Overall, the 2E Platinum was one of the sleeker, more modern-looking 2E systems you could buy, although there is one more Apple II system to go over in the collection, and that is the Apple II GS. Specifically, this was limited edition 2GS with a silkscreen of Steve Wozniak's signature. These were released to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Apple II line, and original buyers of this machine were mailed a certificate of authenticity, which I unfortunately do not have. Depending on who you ask, finding a limited edition Woz Apple II GS is like finding a needle in a haystack, while others will tell you that it's a relatively common machine. And according to the numbers, the latter seems to be true, with the first 50,000 2GSs produced sporting the Wozniak signature. And as a personal anecdote, I see the Wozniak limited edition 2GSs popping up online for sale almost as frequently as the normal 2GSs. Chronologically, the 2GS was released before the Apple IIe Platinum in September of 1986, but I included it last in this list of Apple II computers just because of how different it is from the rest. The most glaring difference being the radical case redesign where the keyboard was no longer built in. It was the first Apple computer to adopt the Apple Desktop Bus interface for external keyboards and mice, an interface that would later be adopted by all future Macintosh computers, starting with the Macintosh 2. And while remaining backwards compatible with the previous Apple II variants, this was the first Apple II to sport a 16-bit microprocessor, that being the Western design 65C816 clocked at 2.8 MHz. Overall, the Apple II GS is significant in that it was the last and most powerful iteration of the Apple II line before Apple put all of their attention and resources into the Macintosh line. And while there was one other quote-unquote Apple II released after the 2GS, that being the Apple IIe on a card, that wasn't a full system and was rather, as its name suggests, an expansion card for Macintosh computers to add some compatibility between the Macintosh and old Apple II software. And I guess I said the 2E Platinum was released after the 2GS, but that was less a brand new machine and more a slight redesign of the older Apple IIe. Speaking of which, while the limited edition Woz 2GS is a relatively common machine despite what some people say, there is a variant of the 2GS which is exceptionally rare. That being the upgraded 2GS, which was offered by Apple to existing 2E owners. Apple would essentially swap the logic board and nameplate of your 2E to a 2GS nameplate and logic board, making a fully functional 2GS housed inside a 2E form factor. And like I said, these are exceptionally rare, and examples of these upgraded machines sell for a pretty penny when they are occasionally listed online. But anyway, that concludes the Apple II portion of my vintage Apple collection tour. Now to move on to the compact Macs in my collection. And kicking off the compact Macs, we have this Macintosh 512K. The 512K was released in September of 1984, less than a year after the original Macintosh, which had a release date of January 1984. And just like acquiring the Apple II Plus due to its similarities to the original Apple II minus the insane prices, I wanted a 512K in my collection due to the fact that it's nearly identical to the original Macintosh, but I won't have to sell one of my internal organs on the black market to afford one. The external case is completely identical to the original Macintosh minus the 512K badge and placement in the back. The only real change was internal, with the quadrupling of the memory from 128K to 512K, hence the 512K name. This 512K came with the 400K floppy drive, though Apple later released the 512K Enhanced, which had the upgraded 800K drive. And alongside this Macintosh, we have the M0110 keyboard and M0100 Macintosh mouse, as well as this secondary external 800K floppy drive. Keep in mind that a secondary floppy drive is a useful tool to have for these early 128 and 512K Macs, as none of these computers shipped with internal hard drives. And while third-party internal hard drive modifications were available, examples of these machines are very hard to come by. There was also the Apple Hard Disk 20, which was an external hard drive that could hook into your 512 via the DB19 connector, though getting a working one can be relatively expensive. Anyway, back to this 512K, this one has been internally restored with a recapped analog board, as well as a repaired and relubed floppy drive with a replaced eject motor gear. And lastly, this 512K has its very own carrying bag. And now to move on to the next Mac in the collection, the Macintosh Plus. I'm not going to spend too much time on this Macintosh Plus as there is a 3-part series on this computer already on my channel, though it is an interesting computer in its own right. The form factor is more or less identical to the 128 and 512K, though the case branding was revised, switching to a silkscreen and smaller Apple logo, as opposed to the larger badges of the Macs before it. Internally, the Macintosh Plus is a bit different, being the first compact Mac to include removable SIM memory modules, making it easily upgradable to up to 4 MB of RAM. It also came standard with the 800K floppy drive, making it the top-of-the-line Macintosh to buy up until the release of the Macintosh SC. Another notable change was the inclusion of the SCSI interface, which allowed for countless peripherals such as this CMS external hard drive. Along with the Macintosh Plus itself, the M0110 keyboard was also revised to the M0110A keyboard, which now offered a numeric keypad. This particular Macintosh Plus has a slightly mismatched platinum gray keyboard, while the computer and mouse are the original beige color. And with that, let's now move on to the next compact Macintosh, the accelerated Macintosh SE. The Macintosh SE was released in March of 1987, with this particular example being one of the older dual 800K floppy drive variants. Back in 1987, you also had the option of getting a single 800K drive with a 20 MB internal hard disk, and later in 1988 you had the option to get a single 800K drive with a 40 MB hard disk. And while this particular Mac started off as the base model of Macintosh SE, it has since received a number of upgrades. For starters, its original 1 MB of RAM has since been expanded to the full 4 MB, and in addition to its dual 800K drives, it also has a third micro SD drive, which has been adapted to its internal SCSI port via a SCSI to SD adapter. And most notably, this SE has had its processor upgraded with the addition of a Radius Accelerator 16 card, a card that adds the mind-bending power of a Motorola 68020 processor, and made for easy installation of the last upgrade to this computer, that being the Radius 2-page display adapter. And while I unfortunately don't have a display to utilize this adapter, I installed it anyway just to fit in with the whole souped-up nature of this Macintosh SE. Speaking of which, this SE also has the Apple adjustable keyboard, which is nowhere near period correct, being released in 1993, but I use it anyway because it's cool, and why not? And that pretty much wraps it up for this Macintosh SE. If you'd like to see more of it, there is a restoration video of it on my channel, but for now it's time to move on to the next Mac, which is a Macintosh SC FDHD. The Macintosh SC FDHD was the final iteration of the original Macintosh SE design. Released in August of 1989, it existed as the mid-tier compact Macintosh on the market, the Platinum Macintosh Plus being the low-end option and the recently released SE30 being the top-of-the-line compact Mac. The FDHD was identical to the SEs before it, though now it included updated ROM and disk controller chips, as well as an updated floppy disk drive known as the Super Drive, which could handle the 1.4 MB high-density floppy disks on top of the older 800K and 400K disks. The FDHD stood for Floppy Disk High Density, though Apple would later change the name of this computer to the Macintosh SC Super Drive. Here you can see this particular Mac retains the original FDHD name, and yeah, it's an overall pretty rough condition. But hey, at least it still has the programmer's key. It also has this nifty little Kensington anti-glare filter which fits over the CRT. The only thing this setup didn't come with when I purchased it was a working SCSI hard drive. So like with the accelerated Macintosh SC, I'm going to be installing a SCSI to SD adapter on this computer at a later date, as well as giving the case plastics a good cleaning and a possible retro bright bath, because as you can see, that Kensington anti-glare filter gave the case a pretty noticeable tan line. But anyway, that's it for the Macintosh SC FDHD. Now to move on to the final compact Macintosh, the Classic 2. The Macintosh Classic 2 was the end of an era in that it was the very last iteration of the original compact monochrome Macintosh. I lucked out on this particular Classic 2 as I got it for a relatively cheap price, though it was in non-working condition. Luckily, the problem with this Classic 2 was leaking caps on the logic board and not something more serious like a leaking battery or a dead hard drive. So after cleaning and recapping the logic board, cleaning the case plastics, and installing a math coprocessor expansion card, this Classic 2 is now running perfectly. Though who knows for how long, the internal SCSI drive is original to the machine and will most likely die out of the blue one of these days. But like with the Macintosh SEs, there's always the SCSI to SD route. With this Classic 2, I have the newer ADB Keyboard 2 and ADB Mouse 2, which are period correct to this machine. And I have to say that of all the compact Macs I've owned, the Classic 2 is definitely one of my favorites, at least in terms of design with its round corners and overall cute vibe. And while the upgraded Macintosh SE is definitely the most interesting of my compact Macs, if I had to choose one to have on display on my desk for extended periods of time, I would definitely pick the Classic 2. But anyway, that wraps it up for the compact Mac portion of this collection overview. Now to move on to the next collection of Macs, or Mac singular, that being the Macintosh LC2. As you've probably noticed, I've been chronicling this vintage Apple collection based on different product lines, but in terms of the Macintosh LC2, it's kind of the oddball in the group. And while Apple released several iterations of the LC line as well as several pizza box style desktop computers in general, the LC2 is the only complete pizza box Macintosh I have in my collection at the moment. I do also have a Quadra 605, but that is currently undergoing a complete restoration and as of the recording of this video is in several pieces. And speaking of restorations, you've probably recognized this LC2 from one of my more recent restoration videos where I recapped its logic board. In that video, we were able to get this computer back to a functional state, but unfortunately during the filming of this video, the internal SCSI drive did what SCSI drives do best, and it died right in the middle of filming these shots. So I guess now is as good a time as any to show you how easy it is just to claw one of these machines apart with your bare hands. You just gently pull up on these two clips on the back while lifting up the top case. And now to locate the problem hard drive. And then it's just a matter of unplugging it from the logic board and releasing it from these 4 plastic clips. Here's the dead Quantum Viking SCSI drive. And that is pretty much all I can do at the moment. This is yet another 68K Mac to add to the list of SCSI to SD candidates. But anyway, back to the rest of this machine. This particular LC2 came with the ADB Keyboard 2, but has the older style ADB mouse. The LC2 had several options for monitors which conformed perfectly to the form factor of the computer, but in my experience, a free Dell monitor from the Facebook Marketplace will also suffice. And that's all I have for this LC2 detour. Now to move on to the next portion of this collection, that being the iMacs. And what better way to start off the iMac collection than with the very first iMac, the Revision A iMac G3. I picked up this G3 with its original keyboard and mouse, which was
the coolest mouse on the planet right here.
Well, maybe not that. It also came with this external iMation Super Disk Drive, which has a very funky connector. As you can see, it's so big it needs this little rubber kickstand to keep it level with the port. Lastly, the iMac's original rainbow power cord was also included. Booting up the machine for the first time, you can see the original owner even left this nice little note for me. The only thing missing from this iMac is the port door, which would have gone over the microphone jack, headphone jack, 2 USB ports, Ethernet, modem, and knockout plug. Hidden in this little bay is also the serial number that gives the exact date and time that this iMac was created, which was the 29th of September 1998, on what I'm guessing is the 48th second of 9:15 a.m. that day. Plopping the iMac on the scale, you can see it weighs a hefty 38.5 pounds. The iMac was the result of Apple trying to set itself apart from other computer companies with unconventional yet elegant and user-friendly design, while also capitalizing on the growing popularity of the internet, billing the iMac as the easiest solution for anyone to get onto the World Wide Web.
Even though this is a full-blooded Macintosh, we are targeting this for the #1 use that consumers tell us they want a computer for, which is to get on the internet, simply and fast.
And with Apple facing bankruptcy in the late 90s, they were really banking on the iMac being a hit. So how did the Revision A iMac do in that regard?
Can you go back there and do that again? Go back and come back.
Well, while the iMac in general was a wild success, as most of you probably know, the Revision A iMac in particular only remained on the market for about a month. Apple quickly realized that some changes needed to be made to the iMac, and so in October of 1998 they released the Revision B iMac, which replaced the Revision A's ATI Rage 2C video card with an ATI Rage Pro Turbo, and increased the video RAM from 2 MB to 6 MB. But other than that, the Revision B was more or less identical to the Revision A, other than the power button now doubling as a reset button for easier crash recovery. So overall, the current value of the Revision A iMac stems mostly from its historical significance as Apple's very first iMac. And if you're looking to get the most out of a G3 iMac in terms of performance, I would look at the later Revision B and C models, as well as the later DV iMacs. Speaking of which, let's move to the next iMac in the collection, that being a Revision C Blueberry iMac G3. The Revision C iMac received a number of upgrades compared to the Revision A and Revision B iMacs, including faster processor speeds from the 233 MHz of the Revision A and Revision B to 266 MHz up to 333 MHz on the Revision C, as well as a larger storage capacity from 4 GB to 6 GB. And while the Revision A and B iMacs only came in one color, that being Bondi Blue, the Revision C introduced several colors to choose from, those being blueberry, grape, tangerine, lime, and strawberry. Apple later released more color options and even patterns in their later DV iMacs, but let's not get into that if we don't have to. Here we have a Blueberry iMac G3 running macOS 9.2, and with this example we can illustrate a few more changes Apple made with the Revision C line. For starters, you can see that the Revision C iMacs no longer include the infrared receiver on the left speaker assembly. And while my Revision A iMac doesn't have its port door, pictures show that a colored ring around the hole meant for routing cables is no longer present on the Revision C. You might also notice that that blank knockout plug also didn't carry over into the Revision C iMacs. However, what is included in the Revision C's included mouse is this little indent meant to give feedback to the user in terms of the orientation of the mouse. Really just a band-aid over the much bigger problem of the iMac mouse being regarded as the worst in the industry. Apple would later ditch the hockey puck mouse entirely in 2000 with the introduction of the Apple Pro mouse.
And so, you know, some people think that this is the worst mouse in the world. We'd like to change that. And today we are introducing a new mouse. Yay!
One other note about this computer is that years later, a third-party company known as ClassicBot would release a much more compact version of the Revision C Blueberry iMac G3 known as the iBot G3. And while much, if not all, of the computing power of the original Blueberry iMac G3 was reduced in this model, it certainly is adorable. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this Revision C iMac G3. Now to move on to the very last computer in this collection overview, that being the iMac G4. The iMac G4 is one of the few items in my collection that has at least some of its original packaging. So I'll start off this showcase with a pseudo unboxing. So the first thing you see upon opening the box is this cardboard insert illustrating different profiles of the iMac G4. Then pulling off the top layer of styrofoam, you get the iMac G4 itself, as well as these two little speakers. The iMac has its own little styrofoam support piece, which I'm going to pull off like so. And then pulling up on the cardboard insert, you have a space for the included mouse, keyboard, power cord, and a space for the software and manuals, which this unfortunately does not have. And once everything's out of the box and assembled, you're left with a clean little setup of this iMac G4. The G4 offered several different display options, those being 15-inch, 17-inch, and 20-inch, while this one is the smaller 15-inch variant. Apple also offered the iMac G4 in several different configurations, but I'm not going to bore you with all of that information. The iMac G4 was released in January of 2002 and was referred to simply as the new iMac, though we retroactively call it the iMac G4 because of its PowerPC G4 processor. It also garnered a few nicknames such as the Sunflower iMac or the Luxo Lamp iMac due to its bulbous half-sphere base and adjustable arm, which gave the display a wide range of motion. This particular iMac still has the protective plastic on its adjustable arm, which I thought was interesting. Around back is the I/O. We have a mini VGA port, 3 USB 2.0 ports, a 56K modem port, as well as a 3-prong power connector, Ethernet 2 FireWire 400 ports, a port for the proprietary speakers that came included with the iMac, a headphone jack, and lastly a Kensington lock. Moving on to the included peripherals, we have the Apple Pro optical mouse, as well as this rather yellowed Apple Pro keyboard. When I originally got this iMac, it didn't come with the Harman Kardon Pro satellite speakers, so I got them after the fact just to complete the whole iMac G4 setup. Overall, the iMac G4 was a radical departure from the CRT-based design of the iMac G3s before it. And come to think of it, it's pretty different from the current iMac design, which started in 2005 with the introduction of the iMac G5. What really set this iMac apart from the rest other than the swivel arm was the decision to house all of the internal components in the base. The reasoning behind this was to avoid nightmare cable management scenarios, which would have resulted if the I/O was positioned directly behind the screen so that oh, right. Another justification was that Apple engineers couldn't run the computer's drives at full speed if they were oriented on their side.
We have to turn the drives on the side. And in particular with the optical drives, they can't run at full speed on the side. We have to slow them way down. The performance goes way down when you turn them on their sides.
Evidently, monorail engineers back in 1996 either found a workaround for this issue or saw it as a worthy trade-off. I actually prefer the iMac G4 design over the later iMacs, and I would go as far to argue that the spiritual successor to the iMac G4 isn't anything that Apple has put out since, but rather something like the Microsoft Surface Studio, which also houses its internal components in a base, while also featuring robust movement of the display with a shiny, novel arm, or I guess arms in the case of the Microsoft Surface Studio. But I digress, the iMac G4 remained on the market as the high-end iMac for about 2 years, while the CRT-based Snow White iMac DV and eMac remained on the market alongside it as cheaper alternatives. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have for the iMac G4 and my desktop / all-in-one vintage Apple collection. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this collection overview. I do plan to release future videos outlining the laptops, tablets, and handheld devices in my collection, as well as some restoration videos that I've hinted at in this video. So other than that, as always, this has been Colonial Puppet. Have a nice day.